Hey folks, today we're going to be doing a two-piece black walnut desk. Now the client supplied the slabs, so I picked up the slabs from the client. They were already flattened, so a little bit less work for me. This is going to be a piece to an L. The desk is going to be L-shaped, and that piece is actually going to be mounted in a corner attached to the wall, so it's kind of going to be floating. And then this bigger piece is going to get some tube steel X-legs. So all I really had to do on these slabs was clean up the defects. There were a lot of knot holes and cracks. There were actually a lot of cracks in this slab all the way around. I had to do all 6 sides. I had to do, the top, the bottom as usual, but I had to do a lot of fills on the edges. So it was a little time consuming because you can only do one surface at a time, and then you have to let the epoxy dry and then move on to the next surface and so on and so on. And it was also on both pieces. So it was a bit tedious, a bit time consuming. I felt like it was never going to end. And also, so here you see me taping the bottom because the bigger slab had a through crack. And this turned out to be a bit of an issue for me. I guess it could have been worse than it was, but it is what it is. So yeah, here I'm just taping up the cracks, getting ready for the epoxy fill on it. Now this slab was a bit to wrestle with. I think it probably weighed, I don't know, I'm gonna say 90 to 100 pounds. So it was a lot for just me. Now I'm just using the Dremel to just clean out some of the fibers and some of these cracks. These cracks have a lot of little fibers in them that would keep the epoxy from soaking in. It would cause some surface tension, and the epoxy might have bubbles and stuff there. So where the fibers bridge the cracks, I'm just cleaning it out with this Dremel. And now I'm just putting some clear non-waxed shellac so that when I do the epoxy fills, it just doesn't stain the surface of the wood. Sometimes the black stains, sometimes it doesn't. I've done a few walnut slabs where I've forgotten to put the shellac on and it didn't stain. But I've also had some pieces that have stains, so I try to always do it. And especially with I've noticed with the caulk, when I make the little dams with the caulk, it's a lot easier to get the caulk off if it's on top of the shellac. It really adheres to the open grain of the wood, so I like to shellac those areas. So yeah, I'm just going around and making dams around all these small little epoxy fills that I have to do. It just keeps the epoxy from spreading all over your surface, less cleanup. And I think, of course, I have, what I do on one slab, I have to do on the other. So the smaller slab also had a through crack as well, so I had to tape that up. So I'm just mixing some black epoxy here. It didn't take much. I think both tables together took about 1.5 liters, so it wasn't so much. It was just a lot of little pores. So mixing, and then I'm going to dump them into the cracks. Got a little sloppy there. And this is the one that's going to come back to haunt me. So now I'm just going to fill a syringe and use the syringe to fill all of the smaller voids, and some of the spots that I poured already and had shrunk a little bit, I'll just add a little to it. The syringe is an easy, neat, clean way of filling those, so I like to use the syringe for that. Never had to do a through crack on a table that wasn't in a form. And what I did was I taped the bottom thinking that would hold it. But as you can see, came out this morning and all of the resin has leaked out of the through cap. Or, sorry, the through crack. There's probably a bit of a mess on the floor. Let's see. Oh, not too bad. I guess the moving blanket caught most of it, so not too bad. What I did find a few days later is that the slab was stuck to the moving blanket, and the moving blanket was stuck to the table. And it was so stuck to the table that I actually ripped a hole through the blanket trying to pull it off the table. And then while trying to pull the blanket off the table, I pulled part of the table up with it. So I'll have to fix that in the future. But like I said, could have been worse. Could have been a lot bigger of a mess. I got most of the mess up with a blunt chisel, and I think I also used a card scraper here just to, scrape the epoxy off before I moved on to the sander. I've said it before in other videos, I find the card scraper and the blunt chisel just work really nicely to get all of the surface epoxy off before moving to sandpaper. The epoxy clogs the sander up a lot, so this is just faster, it works a lot better. So anyway, yep, cleaned up the mess with that. And then we moved on to doing the crack fill over again. So second batch of black epoxy, just pouring it in the cracks, and then a few other cap offs of the other fills that I did where it just shrunk a little or absorbed into the wood, and it just needed a little bit more to bring it up to level. Once I get this capped off, then we bring the torch out, do a little bubble popping, always a satisfying task. While the epoxy was curing on the bigger part of the desk there, I moved on to the second piece. I started removing all the bark off the live edge so that I can get in with the sander and clean it up. Now, I didn't take the bark off all the way to the sapwood. I left like a thin layer there because the customer wanted to preserve as much of the detail on the live edge as possible. So after I got it close with the chisel, then I moved on with a nylon wire wheel on the drill to remove the rest of it. And once I was done with the bark, I moved back to the bigger table and I'm cleaning up the overflow of the epoxy with the card scraper, getting it prepped for sanding. So here I removed as much as I could with the blunt chisel and the card scraper, and now I'm starting by sanding the bigger epoxy fills off, and then I'll evenly sand the whole table once that's done. So this is obviously sped up. I don't sand that fast. But what I wanted to show in this footage here is, see that little shiny spot there where the epoxy is below the surface and it's not getting caught with the sander? Yeah, that little bit came back to haunt me as well. You'll see a little further down. So now I'm back to the crotch of the desk, and I'm using a little, I think that's a nylon wheel as well on the Dremel, and I'm just cleaning up the dirt and whatever's on the surface here. Now you can see faintly there's termite tracks there, and again the customer wanted to preserve those, so again I'm just using like this little nylon wheel on the Dremel to remove the dirt and trying to keep all the natural features of the wood as I can. So this was, this is sped up as well. This was a bit tedious, it took some time, but in the end I think it was well worth it. This area of the table is one of my favorites visually. It really turned out nice. Unfortunately, I'm not that great with the camera, and the finished footage, it really doesn't give it justice. I think I'm gonna have to invest in some better lighting. And now I'm filling up a syringe with black epoxy to fill some of these hairline cracks in with. I find this is a little easier to force the epoxy into the crack and not make such a mess. It's a little hard, it's a little difficult getting the epoxy into the syringe. A lot of times I'll use a double boiler and stick the container of epoxy in the hot water just to make it a little more fluid so that it's easier to load into the syringe. Once it's in the syringe, ejecting it into the cracks isn't that bad. It's just getting it into the syringe is a bit difficult. Now here's the nylon wheel on the drill I was talking about. And this looks a bit aggressive, but most of what you're seeing fly off there, the dust, is just dirt. It's dirt coming off the live edge. It's not sawdust. I mean, maybe it's a little bit of sawdust, but most of it's dirt. Those nylon bristles are actually pretty flexible and soft. Now we're moving on to bow ties. So both tables had a split in it. And the bigger table, I'm putting 2 bow ties in there, and the smaller table is going to get 1. And I don't have a bandsaw, so I found the easiest way for me to cut bow ties is on the table saw. So I'm just setting the blade here. I think it was like 11 degrees I made them, and then I use the table saw sled to cut all 4 sides of the bow tie. I made a whole video on this. It's pretty simple, but basically I just line it up on a line there. I cut one side of the bow tie, flip it over, cut the other side, flip it upside down, cut the next side and the next side, and that's all 4 sides of the bow tie. So it was pretty easy to bang out 3 or 4 bow ties without having a bandsaw. So let's cut 2. I'm going to pop it off the clamp. Flip it upside down. And I don't know why in this footage I'm lining it up to a line. This might have been the first one I did. After the first one I actually just put a block there so I could just, instead of lining it up to the pencil line, I just butted it up to the block. It was a lot faster and easier. So there's the 3rd cut, and now I'm just going to rotate it again and make the 4th cut, and that's all there is to making a bow tie on a table saw sled. I think it's actually probably easier than the bandsaw. So I didn't bring the blade quite to the middle because I was afraid it wouldn't align right. I thought it was easier to align it on the line on the sled without it, and then I just cleaned it up with a chisel, that little nub there. And you can see it came off quite easy. So yeah, that's it. Making bow ties on a table saw sled. So now I'm just putting the bow ties onto the desk for placement and marking it out. And then what I'm going to do is use some double-sided tape to stick it down and then mark it out with my marking knife. But in the future, I think I might try using the blue tape and CA glue method, because even though this was really thin double-sided tape, it still flexed a lot when I was trying to mark it out with my marking knife. So what would happen is when I pushed the knife against the bow tie to mark it, it would move, the opposite direction. And then when I went over to the other side and marked it with the marking knife, it pushed it in the opposite direction. So what ended up happening is the marks that I made were actually a little bit smaller than the bow tie because it moved side to side when I was marking it. It wasn't a big deal. I just cleaned it up with a chisel, but I think it'd just be easier if it was exact the first time, so I'll try the blue tape. And now I just have a little clean out bit in the router, and I'm just hogging out the majority of the bow tie with the router, and then I'm going to go back with a mortising chisel and clean out all of the edges. Now I lost the footage of that, so there's no footage of cleaning out the bow ties with the mortising chisel, but I do have some footage of cleaning out the inset for the table legs with the chisel, so there's that. Now I'm just taking the high spots off with a plane before I sand them smooth to the surface of the table. So I think this is a number 5 plane, but it made pretty quick work of it, and I'm just hitting it with the sander. Just this one spot where the bow tie was, and then again I'll sand the whole table evenly after I just get that flush. So you see the number 3 on there. So the bigger slab of the desk took 2 bow ties, and now this is the smaller slab, and I'm just getting 1 bow tie at the end here. And it's the same process, marking it out, double-sided tape, stick it down, trace it out with the marking knife, hog it out with the router, and then clean it up with the mortise and chisel. One thing I think I did forget to mention is the client didn't want to see the bow ties, so all these bow ties are on the bottom side of the table, so they won't be seen. So a lot of work for something that's not going to be seen. But I guess that's not as big a crime as a mortise and tenon or a bridle joint that will never be seen. So we went from that rough, routed out inlay to now a crisp, clean inlay, because I lost the chisel footage. But anyway, so now I'm just using some Titebond, I'm gluing it in, and then you see with the toothpick over there, I already mixed some Titebond with walnut dust just to go around the edges of the inlay in case there's a little bit of a space there. I know it's the bottom of the side of the table, so it really doesn't matter that much, but I guess it's good to do as best you can, right? So just pushing it in with the toothpick, and then I think I'm going to come around with a glue spreader, and I'm just going to force it into the sides. It actually came out pretty tight. There's one little line you can see a little, but it came out pretty good. Okay, so I already hit it with a planer to knock it down, and now I'm just sanding it flush with the top of the table. Obviously, again, this is sped up. I think this is 4 times the speed. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually sand this fast? Okay, so here's all 3 bow ties sanded flush, and now we're going to move on to sanding the live edge. So since it's a live edge and it's all uneven, and like I said, the client wanted to preserve as much detail as possible, I just did a light hand sanding after, the nylon wire wheels. Normally I would hit this with the 5-inch random orbit sander, but that would just be too aggressive. So like I said, light hand sanding just to get it a little cleaner, and that's going to really be it for the live edge there. Well, I thought that was going to be it. So while sanding, I noticed that this divot, crevice, whatever you want to call it here, had a bit of a punky spot. So I'm just taking like a dental pick here and just getting all of the loose wood and debris out. And it looks like it extends into the slab a little bit, so I had to inject some epoxy in there just to firm it up. And this time I'm just using some clear epoxy, just so you don't have a lot of contrast with the live edge there. The sapwood is very light, so I thought the black epoxy would just be too dark there. So I'm just filling it with some clear epoxy just to bind everything together and make sure there's nothing coming out of there after the table's finished. Okay, so I believe at this point all of the the epoxy filling is complete, and now I'm on to the final sanding process. So doing the usual 80, 120, 150, 180, and I do 220 in the epoxy areas just so there's less visible scratches. Sometimes with the 180 you still see those little pigtail scratches in there, so I find if I hit it again with the 220 it takes care of most of that and you don't see anything. And now I move to the blue nylon wire wheel. That one's a little bit finer and softer than the red one, and I'm just giving the live edge another once over before finish goes on. Okay, so now we're on the bottom of the table, and I'm setting up the router to inlay the base of the table legs. I like to recess that plate into the table just to give it a more finished look. So I'm gonna hog out most of it with the router, and then I'm going to clean the edges up with the chisel. So I'm just freehanding this. I could have made a template, but I just decided to freehand it. You know, I'm probably 1/8 of an inch or so off of my marking line, and like I said, I'm just going to go back and clean it up with a chisel. It doesn't take too long. Right, so on to the chisel cleanup. I think this is a 26mm chisel, which is the widest chisel I have. I think it's about 1 inch. So it's a little tedious, but it didn't take long to just go all the way around and knock the waste out. And then the corners were a little bit smaller, so I think that was probably around a 3/4 inch chisel or so. And I just had the 2 legs, so that I just had to do this twice, and that was it. Like I said, the smaller desk is just going to be floating, so there's no legs going on that one. Okay, now a quick little sanding, and no one's going to see this, it's going to be under the legs, but I do finish under there just so that it doesn't absorb the moisture, so it's best just to sand it, close the grain up a little bit. This way, also when you put the finish on, it's the same color as the rest of the table. If I didn't sand it down to the same grid as the rest of the table, it'd probably be a little darker. Okay, bringing the legs back now, I'm going to mark out where the inserts are going to go for the screws. And it's just going to get 4 inserts, 1 in each corner. I think I use 1/4 inch inserts here, and then it has a 20 thread. I think that's a pretty standard size in the furniture industry. So I'm just marking these out with a nail punch. If you have a brad point bit the same size as the hole that's needed for the insert, it's usually better to mark it with that since it's the exact size. I didn't have one, so I'm using the punch, and I'm just going to drill it out with the appropriate bit. I think it's 3/8 or slightly smaller than 3/8 for those inserts. And once I drill them out, then I'm just going to come back with a chamfer bit just to give that hole a bevel so that the inserts just seat nicely. Also, you know, it just looks nicer. And it also, you know, it seats just below the surface as opposed to being slightly above it. And it makes for easier to finish it too. So this table's getting 2 legs, and I think when I was marking the inserts out with the legs, I used 1 leg for both sides of the table, and these legs are handmade, and the plates on the top weren't exactly the same, so I probably should have used the respective legs for the respective sides. So what ended up happening is one of these holes is slightly in the wrong spot. So I had to go back to the base of the table leg and just ream that out a little bit. So I just used a Dremel with either a sanding wheel or a grinding bit. I forget what it was, but I just reamed that hole out like 1/8 of an inch just so I could get the screw in the hole and lined up with the insert. And that worked pretty well. There was no other adjustment needed after that. So this is the last water pop before the final sanding coat, and now you can really see what the table is going to look like when it's finished. Again, I love that crotch area with the contrast, the light, the dark. It looks like a feather going down the center of it. And then with the termite tracks in there, I think it really looks nice. Like I said, the photography doesn't do it justice, but it turned out really nice. So yeah, just doing the final sanding here. And now I'm starting the finish process. So I always do the bottom first, and I cover it all even under the table legs. And then in the same day, like I'll let this dry for a couple hours, I'll flip it over and I'll do the top, And this is because I'm doing this in an un-air conditioned garage, and I just don't want the table to absorb or let go of any more moisture on one side than the other, especially on a slab, because it's really susceptible to cupping or warping. A traditional table that has thinner join boards is a little less likely, but a slab's really at risk to warping if one side can absorb or let go of moisture at a different rate than the opposing side. And this is Rubio Monocoat Pure. The only two finishes I really use are Rubio Monocoat and Osmo Poly-X. I like those two finishes the best. Okay, a few hours have gone by, and now I'm gonna flip it over and start the finishing process on the top side. So when I did the bottom, I only did the bottom. Now that I flipped it over to the top side, I'm gonna do the whole top and all of the edges all the way around the table, all in one shot. If you've never used the Rubio before, you just work it in with a white pad until the surface is not absorbing anymore, and then you wipe it all off with a blue shop towel. You let it dry for 24 hours, you come back with a maroon pad and give it a buff, and then you put your second coat on the same way as you did the first coat. And you can put a third coat, the same process if you want. And that's all there is to Rubio. Okay, remember when I said that little shiny divot in that epoxy was going to be a problem? Well, here's what happened. So I filled that divot with some black CA glue, and it dried a different, I don't know if it was a different color, a different sheen, but it was noticeable. You saw that spot there. So then what I did was I ground it all out and I poured some epoxy, but I only had to do a little batch. So what I did is I used the caps to the epoxy bottles to mix the epoxy. And the problem with small batches, if the ratio isn't right on the money, it doesn't cure correctly. And that's what happened here. You just saw me touching with my finger and it was still sticky. So usually I use syringes to do it, so I get an exact amount. See, I'm showing the bottle cap there, and I use the bottle cap, and I think that the thicker of the two components of the epoxy, the thicker component got caught in the rings, the threads of the cap, and didn't pour into my mixing container, and the ratio was off, and it just didn't dry. So I had to go back with the Dremel. I had to grind that area all out. I had to mix some new epoxy the right way with syringes and fill it and sand it again. So another pain, another reason why I like working with epoxy less and less. There always seems to be some sort of problem. It's messy. It's just epoxy's no fun, but sometimes that's just what the client commissions and you have to do it. So here I'm pouring the epoxy into the divot again, and then the sanding process again, and I had to do the finishing process all over again just because of that one little spot. So I won't take you through the whole process of finishing again. Just this one little bit of sanding, and then we move on to the finishing of the second desktop. And we'll speed this up real fast because we've seen this before too. Same thing, Rubio Monocoat. Nothing's different from this bit than the bigger bit. Now here's something new for me. So since this is a desk and it's going to get a lot of use, I'm using Blacktail's ceramic coat. So what I was just showing there was the pre-finish, and you wipe it all down with the pre-finish, you let it evaporate, and this is the hard coat now that I'm putting on. And the smaller desk, I did the whole desk in one shot. The smaller desk is, I don't know, it was 36 inches by like 26 inches or something like that, so I was able to do it all in one shot. But basically you wipe it on, You wipe it horizontally, you wipe it vertically, you wait a minute, you wipe it on until it gets tacky, and then you wait a minute. And now what I'm doing is with the edge of that pad, I'm just what they call leveling it. I'm just dragging it across the top to remove any of the high spots of the finish. And then you set another timer for 60 seconds after that's done, and then you come back with one of those microfiber towels, and then you buff it out. And then that's it. You let it dry for 24 hours, and then there's a top coat that you put on the same exact way. And what they say is the hard coat is what gives it the durability, but that top coat has a little elasticity in it. So if you slide a glass across it or something like that, the top coat will flex a little, and it won't put a scratch into the hard coat. So, and that's like the sacrificial sort of layer. And unfortunately, the client wouldn't let me film the install in his house, so I just have these stills that I took of the finished project. So I do apologize for that, but I hope you've got something out of this video, and thank you for watching.